the voter. This is exactly what we've tried to do. I mean, essentially, the key question we are trying to answer, the sort of, core question, because we do loads of different things, but the core question is, what goes on in people's minds when they're in the polling booth? Now, that's, in many ways, that's one of the founding movements, or one of the founding symbols of political life, right? We know that, at the heart of democracy, there are people who go to a polling booth and who cast a vote, and then they choose the government, and then everything follows from there. And at the same time, this is something we don't really know very much about as a discipline, as political scientists. I mean, we know how to explain the vote of people, but that particular moment is a moment which is not really very well understood. Now, why should we try and understand it better? Well, one of the facts that we found by talking to people, and I'm going to tell you about the methods in a few minutes, is that in every election, usually there are between 30 and 40% of people who will either make up their minds or change their minds about who to vote for within a week of the election. In some cases, about half of those people will do that on election day itself. So there is something about that atmosphere of the polling station, of the polling booth, and something about those mechanisms at stake when people vote, which can lead some people to vote in a way which is going to surprise them. They will go and vote expecting to vote for the right, and in the polling booth they will decide that they want to vote for the left. There is something happening which, in a way, cannot be explained very satisfactorily by political economy approaches, political sociology approaches, because all those approaches will enable us to understand why people should be more likely to vote more left-wing or more right-wing, and something like that, but not, why there is something happening in this very last moment. I'll give you one example. I was recently in Dublin, where I was expert witness for a case to the Supreme Court on a referendum result which was challenged, and I had to do some study for the Supreme Court about whether receiving a certain information booklet influenced the voters. And one of the things which I found by looking at the studies that were made at that time is that for that referendum, which was relatively low salience, about 80% of voters made up their mind about who to vote for in the last week before the vote. So for low salience election, even more so, there is something which happens, a sort of bubbly atmosphere which takes place just before people vote. So the problem at the same time is that the dream of many political scientists could be to put a spying camera, a big brother camera inside a polling booth to see what happens in there, but we can't do that because the vote is also the ultimate taboo in democratic politics, right? I mean, the whole point of the secrecy of the vote is that precisely you can't spy on people when they actually vote. So you have to rely on other things. You have to rely on what they tell you, self-reporting, and what they tell you usually is going to be something which will take place several days, very often after they have voted. And you don't even know if what they are telling you is the truth or not. And in fact, even if they wanted to tell you the truth, you don't even know whether they know the truth themselves. I mean, how many of you can explain all the times when you have actually changed your minds about something? You might think that you know what happened, you might think that you know why you changed your mind, but we never really know, because part of that decision is also unconscious. So our whole challenge in this project, and one which keeps us very busy in very many different countries, has been to try and figure out how we can actually approximate our understanding of that crucial moment and everything which actually goes around it. So what we try to explain essentially is what's the role of electoral memory, personality, emotions on the way people vote, and also whether there is any interaction between the psychology of voters and what we call electoral ergonomics, which is a concept that we designed, we crafted to encompass, if you want, the impact of every little details that people deem to be irrelevant in the organization of the vote. Typically, when you've got electoral commissions looking at how to organize the vote, they will care about safety, avoiding fraud, and cost. But there will always be that pretense that, whether you have a small paper ballot, a big paper ballot, a colored paper ballot, a black and white paper ballot, an electronic paper ballot shouldn't make a difference. And as political scientists, all we can say is that that claim sounds impossible. It's not conceivable that details like those would not make any impact, or at least that we should assume that it doesn't make any impact on the way people vote and on the way people feel about it. So those are the different things which we are looking at, which comes up to something like that. Sarah and I really like this graph. It's really neat as compared to my usual messy things and are usually more artistic combinations. But essentially, you've got these things with personality, emotion, memory, electoral identity, which is a concept which we'll mention briefly about whether we've got that model whereby we think of voters as seeing themselves as referees or supporters within an electoral race, and then the interaction of all the things with the design of the electoral system, and then our dependent variables, which include democratic satisfaction, do all these things have an impact on the way people perceive democracy and elections. Participation, does it have an impact on turnout? Electoral choice, and then not only efficacy, but also how people vote, whether they vote, for instance, in an egocentric way or a sociotropic way. How do we do it? Well, we've got a huge combination of methods. That's what Deakin was referring to. We're planning to actually have even more with your center and to start looking at physiological experiments. But at the moment, we already have a fairly neat battery of combinations of quantitative and qualitative methods, which again we try to put together, to superimpose together, precisely because we can't actually figure out exactly what happens in the polling booth, and therefore we think that we need to combine a lot of different methods, each of which is imperfect in its own right, so that by superimposing them we got an approximation, if you want, a bit of almost like a factor analysis Venn diagram. You sort of do all these things, each of which have some sort of error in them, and then what you have at the core is probably your best approximation of what happens in the polling booth. So what do we have? We've got mass surveys, which are multi-wave, multi-year surveys. So for instance, we started the first one in the UK in 2010, and it's still ongoing. We've got a minimum of 2 waves, depending on the country, but in some of them we've got 3, 4, 5 waves. We've got some in-depth interviews where we have people talk for about 1 hour to voters about what they remember of past elections, how they feel when they vote, and things like that. We've got some spot interviews that we do just outside of polling stations, when we ask people, in one sentence, can you tell me what went through your mind when you were in the polling booth? Sort of on a quasi-psychoanalytical question, if you want. We've got something which we really like, which is a series of election diaries. So in every country, we recruit with an element of randomness some people who are going to fill in a page of election diary every day to tell us, what they've heard about the election, what they've discussed with people in their family or at work, their thoughts about the election. They do that for about 1 month before the election, till a few days afterwards. We've got some direct polling station observations, which means that we make some agreements with electoral observers in a number of countries, and we give them a questionnaire to fill in, and they will tell us, how people dress when they go to vote. How do they go to vote? Do they come on their own? Do they come with children? Do they come with families? Do they come with friends? Do they say hello? What sort of questions do they ask? Do they look happy? Do they look worried? So, a whole bunch of questions which really relate to the life of a polling station, if you want. Then we've got some field experiments and some lab experiments. We've done some experiments on e-voting, for instance. We've done some experiments of the use of social media in electoral campaigning. We've done one experiment which I particularly love. I'm sorry for Elaine, Deakin, and André, because they've heard all of that at lunch already, but it's still an experiment which I find really exciting. We made an agreement with some professional cameramen and filmmakers, and we actually filmed the shadow of people in the polling booth. So we actually recruited people, we told them it was a simulated election. We told them they could be filmed wherever they would be in the polling station, but nobody would expect to have their shadow filmed when they were in the secrecy of the polling booth. And we actually filmed their shadow. You can't recognize them, but you can see every aspect of their emotion. whether they look nervous, whether they look happy, whether they actually tap their feet. And what we did there as well is that we actually had 3 different types of ballot. A US type voting machine, which is used, of this sort, which is used in many US counties. A UK style ballot, which has a list of names and people just tick the box corresponding to the candidate they want to vote for, and a French type ballot, which has one individual ballot for every name, and in a few minutes you'll see what happens. So we combine all these things. We do some simulations. We've done some spotlight on first-time voters and free voters. So we've got a whole range of methodologies which we try and use together to precisely approximate what happens, what electoral psychological mechanisms are at stake when people vote. Now, we had a bit of a discussion on how we should actually organize that presentation, but we had several ways of doing it. One of them would be to present a paper on a specific aspect of our findings, which we've done in a number of places. But we thought because your center and our center, sorry, our initiative, are so closely interlinked, and because we've got all those repeated links together, and that we hope to continue building on them, we thought that the way we would do it instead would be to give you a sort of, shall I say, state of our findings. Just a sort of possibly quite descriptive list of some of the things we've come up with at this stage, so that you know essentially where we stand. And we thought that that would be a better way of doing it. I hope it's going to work. That's not the way we always do it, but we thought it would be a good way of sort of sharing the current state of the art of our project. The way we're going to design it is that I'm going to talk to you first about the electoral psychology aspects of the research, and then in a second time about the electoral ergonomics aspect, which is about this impact of electoral mechanisms and organization. Psychology. I'll skip the research question because I don't want to speak too long, because I want us to have time to have a proper discussion between you and us. But the first results are the one which I was telling you about. So about 20–30% of people who make up or change their minds within a week of the election. That's for what we would call first order election, and then for second order it can be much more. And overall, 29% of US citizens and 40% of French citizens have already changed their mind on the very day of an election. So no longer a week, but the actual day, half of them in the polling booth. How about some of the emotions? We call that presentation the emotional act of voting, because I think that's one of the assumptions which are often made in existing literature, both the academic literature and the sort of media perception of the vote, is that citizens are considered to be apathetic. And part of the claims that we make more and more as we progress with our fieldwork is that very few citizens are actually apathetic. Many citizens are cynical, but apathetic ones are actually quite rare, because many people, whether they are happy or disappointed with the state of politics, seem to care. And the way they express their care is by showing some sort of emotion in connection to the vote. So look at that first finding. I love that one. 25% of Americans have already cried because of an emotion. How many of you expected that the proportion would be so high? I mean, we normally don't expect people to be so emotionally connected with something like voting that they would actually cry because of it. One of the questions we had for lunch was whether it was the same for men and women. Yes, we are actually as likely to cry as the ladies are, and there is a variety of reasons why people cry. It could be out of happiness, out of sadness, because they're really frustrated by the result, or because they're really excited, or sometimes people tell us they cry without even knowing why, just because they see other people being excited. So there is this element of emotion, but also an element of togetherness, if you want, which takes place during elections, which goes with the second finding, which is that 60% of voters tell us that they feel excited at the moment when they cast their vote in the poll. That, again, to us, is a very important indication of the stakes that people attach to the act of voting. So, in other words, what we are unveiling little by little is that people care about elections. It means something to them. It's an important moment in their life. It's an important moment in the definition of their identity as a citizen, and I'll show you how in a few moments. People also feel proud, and they also feel worried, for instance, when they vote. How about memories of election? That's the second part of what we try to do. And again, I'm sort of apologizing for the choice we've made of giving you this sort of very broad panorama of our findings, and again, insisting perhaps a bit more than we usually do on some of the descriptive results, but I think some of them are also the most intriguing ones in many ways. When we look at the people's memory of elections, one of the things which we are trying to do is to go against one very general perception of political science, which is that when we think as a discipline of the memory of elections, we assume that what people will remember is who they voted for. Now, if you go back to the psychology literature and the concept of memory, psychologists will tell you, well, there is essentially three different components of memory. Visual, what you see, auditive, what you hear, and haptic, which is what you touch. Who you voted for is neither auditive, nor visual, nor haptic. So, unless psychologists are globally wrong about what people should remember, then what they should remember about elections is certainly not who they voted for. And what this means is that the fact that people don't remember who they voted for, because they don't really actually rationalize those answers in surveys, does not mean that they actually don't remember anything about past elections. And if it does not mean that they don't remember anything about elections, we thought we should try and figure out what they remember about elections and how it matters. So if we actually go back to the sort of very traditional psychological definition of memory as visual, auditive, and haptic, what could people remember? Well, they could remember discussions they have with people, that's auditive. They could remember the atmosphere of the polling station, that would be haptic. Or they could remember images from election night, that would be visual. Those are things that people would be much more likely to remember from past elections, and they could remember either things which are sociotropic, like who won, for instance, or things which are egocentric, like having an argument with someone. And when we speak to people and we ask them what they do remember from past elections, we're interested in two different things. First of all, which elections do they remember? And secondly, what aspects of the elections do they remember? And then at a later stage, we're interested in what's the impact of that memory on what they do later, including the likeliness to participate and who they voted for. Now, a number of things are really quite interesting here. The first one is that when it comes to which elections people do remember, well, there is the obvious aspect of recent elections. I mean, people do remember what happened a few years ago, but they also remember two different types of elections. First of all, what we could call major realignment elections, like 2000 in the US or 2002 in France, elections which have resulted in some electoral shocks for societal reasons. And secondly, egocentrically important elections. And what we find is that 82% of American citizens, for instance, remember their first election, and some of them remember it very well in details. And 70%, possibly even more interestingly, do remember childhood elections. So before they were even citizens, people do remember having gone to the polling station with their parents, for instance. And the memories that people do associate with those egocentric elections, in many ways, are much more likely to predict their future behavior, in particular their likeliness to turn out, than other elections. For instance, when we look at the impact of remembering, of having been to an election with your parents when you were a kid, when you control for every other aspect of family influence, like whether your family was interested in politics and things like that, when you control for all those things, it still has a very strong statistically significant impact on your likeliness to turn out as an adult as well. Secondly, what do people remember? And there again, the really interesting thing is that the personalized memories, are actually much more prominent, much more vivid in people's minds than the sort of sociotropic memories. In particular, we've got loads of people who actually have memories of either discussions or arguments that they've had with people during elections. We've had, in the interviews, for instance, we've had several people telling us, oh, when I think of elections, I think of breaking up with my boyfriend or girlfriend because we didn't want to vote for the same people, or the discussion I had with my parents before my first vote. So people sort of crystallize those important arguments or discussions, which, in a way, made elections important in their lives. Another thing that people remember a lot are the haptic memories of the feeling, they're feeling the atmosphere of the polling stations, about 75% of people, and also images of election night. Comparatively, people do not remember who they voted for that well. Even when you ask them directly, many people will tell you that they don't actually remember who they voted for that well. Impact of memory, as I mentioned, there isn't that much impact of electoral memory on who you vote for, but it does an important impact on your likeliness to vote. And it also has a very strong impact on your perceptions of democracy and your levels of efficacy. In other words, the more individualized or egocentric memories you have, the more likely you are to feel both efficacious and satisfied about democracy, having the impression that your vote is important and everything. I'm moving out a bit quickly again. We can sort of go back with everything. I sort of, you know what, I'm going to skip those because I want to actually have time to tell you a little bit about the electoral algorithm things. But there is another really interesting element. I told you about the important act of voting and how voting actually has an impact, how the fact of voting, being in the election atmosphere, as a way of starting, if you want, some psychological mechanisms which people didn't really think were possible. Now, we did a sort of experiment whereby we actually had in-depth interviews with people about 2 weeks before the election, for about half of the sample, and for the other half of the sample, again randomly selected, to the day after the election. And one of the things we did is that we, asked them for those narratives about elections, how they feel about elections, what it means for them, histories and so on, they remember from election, and we actually sort of put them together and created what we call some word clouds, which are simply some measures of the occurrence of a number of words. When you look at the results before the election, one of the things you'll find is that there are a lot of negative references. Worried, lies, foreign, bayonets, nervous, negative. When you do the same question after the election, look at the references we get. Democracy, relief, excitement, democracy, choice, hope. There is something about the atmosphere of the election which certainly gives democracy what some of our colleagues would call a reservoir of goodwill. In other words, when you actually ask people about democracy and elections in general, outside of the election context, you get a lot of the cynicism which we know is present at the heart of citizens' feelings about politics. But the fact that they participate in election will suddenly change their perception of the democratic game and sort of give them a will, if you want, to see the good side of democracy and feel that they're actually important and that there is that sense of togetherness that I was mentioning a bit before. So that, I thought, was really one of the interesting aspects of our research as well, because it's sometimes a bit difficult to use qualitative evidence for someone like me who's sort of trained as a hardcore quantitativist originally. And at the end of the day, that's the sort of feeling you can only get really through qualitative methods in a way. You make people talk, and then you realize that the discourses change. When you make them talk about elections in general in an abstract context, or at the time when those electoral emotions are actually mobilized. I'll skip this bit just to move on to the algorithm. Again, we have loads of results. If you're interested in the models and we have loads of impact on the role of various personality traits and emotions on who people vote for, on their likeliness to be efficacious and things like that, but we can talk about that later if you want to do questions and answers. Otherwise, I thought I would mention to you briefly some of our findings in the context of electoral economics, because in many ways, that's possibly an even newer aspect of research. But just to give you a sense, for instance, the research on personality, we had some questions where we asked people what's their favorite color, or what animal they would compare themselves to, or how they would rank the 10 Commandments or the 7 deadly sins, and we use actually that to predict and explain the way they look. So a lot of cool stuff, weird stuff, if you would like to call it that way. But let's talk about electoral ergonomics. Well, if you try to think of designing an ergonomic pen, for instance, and you ask what is an ergonomic pen, many people will say, well, an ergonomic pen is a pen which is designed to fit very well in people's hands, right? The problem is that if this is how you define ergonomy, this is the pen that I'm going to design, because that fits very well in my hands. The problem with it is that it includes the object, the subject, but not the function. In other words, that design of an ergonomic pen forgets that a pen is here to write with. So what we define as electoral ergonomy is a function of a product, if you want, of a function and of the psychology of human beings. And the whole problem, if you want to understand the ergonomics of election, is to understand how we define the function of elections. Because institutionalists who have been largely dominant in political science will say the function of elections is to appoint the people who are going to govern us. The problem with that is that this is the function from the point of view of the institutions, from the point of view of the political system. But from the point of view of democracy, there are plenty of other functions of elections, including the fact to make people feel part of democracy, to make them feel efficacious, to give them, to give some legitimacy to the system. That all of us as behavioral political scientists know that it's important and know that elections serve that purpose. But these things are usually forgotten, if you want, as functions of election. And if you actually do take them into account, suddenly you will start asking yourself how the design of the various aspects of the organization of the vote can be organized in such a way as to optimize the fulfillment of those particular functions. And what we do in our study of electoral ergonomics is that all those little aspects of the design of the electoral system and the electoral procedures that people assume to be neutral, we question again. We say, well, how do we know it's neutral unless we actually test it? Can we test it? And we find some big differences. So I'm just going to give you a few examples of some of the differences that we find. I'll skip the literature a bit, and I'll just give you a few examples. Some of them are the product of experiments, some of them are the result of the analysis of our study and so on. The first finding is based on our panel study survey. And what we did is that we actually used the panel study to ask people plenty of questions about 3 weeks before the election, including, for instance, who they are planning to vote for. And that gives us a whole range of control variables which we can use, because the night after the election, we ask people, among other things, whether they voted and who they voted for. Now, let's look at 25 to 45-year-olds. So, 18 to 25-year-olds. So people who are essentially first-time voters or sometimes second-time voters. When you control, we're in the UK, in the 2010 general elections, and people who want to vote have two options. Either they go to a polling station, or they ask to receive their ballot by post, and then they actually do receive the ballot by post anyway, and they decide to actually put it in an envelope and then send it to register a postal vote. When we control for everything, people's basic social demographics, their voting intention, 3 weeks for the vote, and everything, we control for all those things. And what we find is that on that basis, after controlling for all that, people who went to the polling station are twice less likely to vote for an extreme right party than people who actually decided to go for postal voting. In other words, we do the other way around, which probably makes more sense. If you're a young voter and you actually cast a postal ballot, after I control for all your social demographic indicators as well as your voting intention 3 weeks before the vote, you are twice more likely, that's quite a lot, to vote for an extreme right party than if you actually went to the polling station. When you look at the next age category, 25 to 45-year-old, that ratio is still 1.5 to 1. In other words, you are 50% more likely in that later age category to vote for an extreme right party if you actually voted if you actually used the postal ballot as opposed to voting in person. And then for all the categories over 45-year-old, there is no difference anymore. So, postal voting, people think that it's only a way of making voting easier, but as a matter of fact, it seems that it also makes people voting in different ways. Second example, that's no longer from a real election, but from an experiment. We did some experiments on e-voting. What we did was that we actually selected young people aged between 16 and 18, so people who have never voted in their lives, and we organized their first election. We did that in 6 different countries, and we randomly assigned them to groups. One group who would be invited to go to a real polling station, which we set up for them, and another group who would be invited to vote on the internet for the candidate of their choice. What we find is that e-voting leads to a much lower turnout, and not a higher turnout, despite what people usually think, than voting in a polling station. If you repeat the experiment, the difference becomes bigger and bigger. In other words, the people who have been invited to vote electronically first time round are less and less likely to vote afterwards, as opposed to people who are invited to go to a polling station who actually are more and more likely to continue voting afterwards. So the whole argument that voting electronically is going to make people more likely to vote doesn't seem to be verified in our experiment. In fact, if you don't do it as a one-shot experiment, but as something which lasts on the longer term, there is actually a very significant turnout cost of introducing e-voting amongst people who have never voted before. In fact, I'll just give you a little story about that. As I mentioned, we randomly assigned people in the two groups, but we selected them in specific cities, and so in some cases, clearly people spoke together and figured out that there were those polling stations open. And we had a number of people who were invited to actually vote electronically using the internet, who pretended to make a mistake and still went to the polling station. And they did that because clearly they wanted to, they wanted their first time to be the real thing. They wanted to see what a real polling station is, what it really feels like to be a citizen, and not just pressing a button on the internet as they would do for a Facebook vote. Then the third example I'll give you is the result of the field experiment I was telling you about. So you remember those 3 possible ballots. We film people's shadows, and one of the things we can actually find by filming people's shadows is that we can see exactly at what time people cast their vote, what time they actually press the button on the voting machine, or what time they actually put the ballot in the envelope for the paper ballots. You remember we have 3 different electoral mechanisms. So another thing we do is that we read and code their emotions. We've got multiple people looking at it, and we check that people find the same things. But that other part of the experiment is, does the type of ballot have an impact on how long people think about their vote before casting it? And the results are quite extraordinary. With the US type voting machine, on average, people thought about 20 seconds before the time they were given the list of candidates to choose between and the time they cast their vote. Using the UK type ballot, where they have to tick a name, on average they thought for about 30 seconds. And that in the US, voting is essentially organized by individual counties, loads of different electoral systems and procedures, essentially. And in particular, you've got some counties which allow people to vote, when people cannot be home or close to the polling station on the day of the vote. Some counties allow people to register a postal ballot, to send it in advance by post, while some other counties instead allow people to go to the polling station several days ahead of the election. Again, you've got that in neighboring countries with similar demographics, similar political traditions and so on. And the assumption which is made is it's exactly the same. And it's not. That's what we find. what we find is that on average, advanced voting makes people feel much more trusting of democracy and feel much more efficacious than people who actually use postal ballots. So in other words, depending on whether your county allows for advanced voting in a polling station or postal voting will have an effect on your whole perception of democracy. It even has a really interesting result, a really interesting effect on what people actually think about when they cast their vote. And on average, when people are using advanced voting, they are much more likely to vote according to who they think is going to be best for their country, as opposed to people who use postal voting who are much more likely to vote according to what they think is best for themselves. So the whole debate between egocentric and sociotropic voting is reflected or mobilized differently by the type of early voting which is allowed by the different countries. So, that's essentially what we wanted to mention to you before opening up to the questions. I think I spoke a bit too long. But just to give you a sort of summary, this is really what we are trying to aim at. We are really trying to understand what the moment of voting represents to people. The first thing we find is that it does represent a lot. Even for people who tell us they are not interested in politics, we've had loads of stories of people who actually were telling us that in many ways election day is not a day like any other. We find that people, when there is an election, also embrace some roles. They put themselves in specific shoes. And as I mentioned earlier, we've got that concept of electoral identity, completely different, for instance, from partisan identification. That's not at all what we're on about. What we found is that by asking people a series of questions about how they see their role as a voter, the narratives they were using were very similar to two very different points of view in sports games. You know that the sports metaphors are always very present when we talk about elections. People talk about a tight race, talk about taking the lead and so on. But it seems that people embrace those metaphors to a point which we don't always assume. And in particular, it seems that the electorate divides almost perfectly, almost 50-50, between people who seem to see the election from the point of view of a referee, who is here to actually determine who is best between the various candidates, and people who see themselves as supporters, people who actually embrace a camp and have the impression that, to a certain extent, their camp winning or losing is partly their loss or their victory. What is even more interesting is that this correlates, of course, to partisan identification and things like that, but far from perfectly. Clearly, the two are very different. There is some level of correlation, but a relatively minor level of correlation. So, that's really what we wanted to talk to you about. That notion that we still have a long way to go to understand exactly what elections mean to people. We have a long way to go to understand what sort of memories and emotions and personality traits are mobilized at the time when they vote, and how those traits, emotions, and memories interact with specific design of the electoral system and the electoral procedures, which will trigger different aspects of the psychology of voters. I think that now we are ready for your questions and answers. We can do them in English, we can do them in French, and we can have both Sarah and myself answering them.
Thank you.